So we have to know the past to understand the present. So Tom, although ISM has more than 100 years of history, right? We won't have enough time today to go back to a century ago. But I would like to exchange our ideas and share perspectives for the past few decades. And that shaped today's economic system and the global supply chain. Where should we begin?
Well, I like to begin with the historical perspective with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
So that's about 33 years ago.
Yeah. So yeah, we're going back just over 30 years. And I think that's highly relevant. And I'll just mention a few key factors. So following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 89, the first major economic event to follow in sequence behind that was reunification of Germany in 1990, which, you have to remember, Germany is an outsized economy in Europe overall. And Germany's economic needs, if you want to go back in history a little bit, arguably were a primary cause of both the First World War and the Second World War. Highly developed industrial base, but lacking the natural resources for energy, for their energy-intensive industries. So both the First and Second World War, one of the proximate causes was German need for coal in France to generate their required energy supply. So the reunification of Germany, therefore, was kind of a seismic economic event in the world. Then we had the collapse of the USSR in 1991, and so that bipolar structure that we had geopolitically no longer existed. NAFTA, people forget NAFTA only came into existence, not the USMCA, but NAFTA came into existence in 1994, and then the WTO replaced the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade in 1995. So that was a major change. That kind of paved the way for the so-called rules-based system of international trade. In 1999, it's only been since 1999 that the euro's been in existence. We kind of have taken the euro for granted. It's been around for more than 20 years, but in fact, in terms of economic history, it's a relatively recent development. China acceded to the WTO in 2001, which was a huge event for the globalization of the macroeconomy. We, I think, in the West had expectations of China, because of its participation in the global economy, becoming a little more Western-oriented in its thinking and its ways. Well, of course, that has not materialized. That theory proved to be flawed, but China as an economic powerhouse, I mean, since 2001, well, go back to 1992 for a minute. China's GDP was about just a little over $400 billion in 1992. Today, it's about $15 trillion. So the Chinese economy has grown by a factor of 30 in the last 2 decades. And that alone is probably the single most important factor of the global, period, the global economic period of the last 3 decades. The level of poverty that's been eradicated as people move to the East Coast cities and got involved in manufacturing in China, for instance, has been probably the biggest migration, economic migration we've seen in human history. And I would say for those 2 decades, between 1990 and 2010, there was a broad consensus around the benefits of international trade and an opening up of markets generally. And then from about 2010 on, we began to see some fragmenting of that consensus, which I think has grown a little bit in the last 10 years. So if you go from 2010 to 2022 today, remember in 2010, China imposed export restrictions on the export of rare earth minerals. And it has a near monopoly on rare earth minerals in the global economy. It was unhappy with its price, the prices it was receiving in the global market. And so it slowed down the export of those rare earth minerals. It lost that case in 2014 to the WTO, but it kind of is a precedent in my mind of China willing to test the rules-based system of the global economy when it's in its own self-interest to do so. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see examples of that going forward. In 2018, the Trump administration announced its Section 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel, ostensibly for national security reasons. And I think that kind of let the cat out of the bag. It made it an acceptable policy choice for many governments around the world to impose tariffs again for the first time really in 20 years. My favorite recent example is in 2019, Japan imposed export restrictions on critical technologies to South Korea that are required for its semiconductor industry, its cell phone manufacturing industry, its computer industry. because of a political dispute that actually started all the way back to World War I and some of its origins. The use of conscripted labor, the use of so-called comfort women during World War I and World War II. Japan contends that this political dispute was settled by treaty agreement, and South Korea is now unhappy with that agreement and has been making noises about revisiting the settlement. And Japan is, clearly thinks that history is behind it, and in order to deal with the political dispute, hit South Korea where it hurt in terms of imposing export restrictions that hurt its economy. So I would suggest Brexit is the other seminal event from 2016. People of Great Britain, that vote is often interpreted as the people of Great Britain saying, we're unhappy about people from continental Europe coming in and taking jobs from us here in the UK. And so it was often interpreted as a reaction to globalization as perceived by the citizenry of the UK. So I would argue that consensus, I wouldn't say that the pendulum against globalization has swung all the way back, but I would say that it has swung back in the direction of recognizing that globalization has maybe not uniform impacts for the benefit of everybody in the economy. I mean, economists would argue that the principle of comparative advantage means we're all better off if we specialize in things we do well. And the standard of living for everybody in all countries improves when comparative advantage is followed. But countries have a hard time sometimes with the sovereignty issues associated with the globalizing economy. And the dislocations caused by globalization are real and felt in everyday lives. The manufacturing base in the United States has declined pretty rapidly since after 1994. And people who had those good paying jobs in manufacturing, while overall everyone's standard of living is better off, if I worked in, let's say, highly specified manufacturing of valves and things for the oil and gas industry, well, we don't make any of those products anymore. Those are all made in China. I had highly specialized skills that I no longer have an outlet for. What am I going to do for a living? So there is short-term pain and dislocation, and governments have to deal with that kind of reality, even though they are making the case that we're all better off in the long run. It's the classic trade-off in economics between short-term pain and long-term gain.
Mm. Yeah, so since WTO was established in 1995, right, their primary purpose is really to open the trade and the benefit of all, to the benefit of all, just as you described earlier. And then I would like to add, 2005, there was a famous book published by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat.
Right.
And then Friedman believes the world is flat in the sense that the competitive playing field between the industry and the emerging market industry countries leveling. And the individual entrepreneur as well as companies, both large and small, and are becoming part of a large, complex global supply chain extending across oceans with competition spanning entire continents. And my personal experience also, I kind of worked, in the past 20 years. So after China joined WTO in 2001, and then China became the manufacturing for the world. And I joined Foxconn in 2003, and then was recruited by Apple in 2005, and then by Google in 2013. So as a result, I have witnessed the massive transition of outsourcing and offshoring that resulted in China's epic growth. So based on the economic theory, right, the collective society made a choice to optimize scarce resources to produce and distribute goods and services in that way. And the sort of that back then, that was a new word, as Friedman described. The US set the tone and led the way, but many others benefited in the slipstream. So in other words, actually throughout my professional career, most industry and companies have enjoyed the benefits of globalization and found no reason to make any change. But of course, the frictional examples that you gave earlier has changed the things, right? So things clearly moving towards something differently. By the end of 2020, so ISCI, our institute at UC San Diego, led the PGM research. So we called a post-globalization research and presented our result to the United Nations with audience from more than 30 countries. So what the movement was really triggered by geopolitical tension, trade war, and accelerated by pandemic and increased the risks beyond industry control. So we actually made a few projections back then. So from short-term standpoint, while China is doing a great job to remain competitive and continues to grow its capacity, the China Plus strategy, whether it's +1, +2, plus multiple, is happening and it will continue in the next few years. And the Southeast Asia country will benefit from this rebalancing opportunity. And from midterm standpoint, that the projection lead to a regionalization model for a balanced approach between efficiency and resilience, and also trying to get closer to the customers to avoid the supply chain disruption. From long-term standpoint, we think US has a real chance to be one of the long-term contenders for the upstream value supply chain enabled by technology and innovation, and in partnership with Mexico in North America. And of course, Latin America and Eastern Europe also present significant potential. But of course, the last projection, that was before the Russian-Ukraine war, right? Which is kind of bring a new threat and a risk to the future of Europe, especially the Eastern Europe countries that potentially could play a major role in the supply chain. So this brings, us to today, which seems like a new wave of globalization is once again upon us. So the World Economic Forum described the phenomenon as globalization 4.0. In a world increasingly dominated by two global powers, as you also mentioned earlier, the US and China. So the new frontier of globalization also involves cyber world. The digital economy is further enabled by artificial intelligence. So Tom, in your perspective, what's driving the supply chain in the future?
Well, I mean, there are two things I think that are first and foremost in my mind, and one of them is kind of highly concerning, and the other maybe not so much. So let's start with the concerning one first. Part of the fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war has been the shutting down, for instance, of social media in Russia, right, as an alternative means of people in Russia getting information about the prosecution of the war. We've seen that in China and other times for different reasons. And so it's led to something that people are theorizing about, which would be called the splinter net, not the internet, but a series of sort of separate internets that don't necessarily talk to one another. And the internet has been such a powerful force for democratization and globalization and information sharing and technology change, innovation, that I think that would be a shame. And similarly, as people are probably aware, one of the sanctions imposed on Russia as a result of their invasion of Ukraine was to kick them off the SWIFT messaging. So SWIFT stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Transactions. It's a messaging system that allows banks to confirm cross-border banking transactions. And if you're not on SWIFT, it's hard for you to trade internationally. China and Russia have talked about developing an alternative platform to SWIFT. SWIFT is by its nature a global platform today. So, and arguably you could see, and actually the current CEO of Foxconn, Helen, has made this point. Foxconn is opening facilities in the United States, although it's heavily concentrated today in mainland China. And he himself has said, we could see a polarization happening in the global economy where we essentially have two sets of economies, two competing economies, and two globalized supply chains. One being China-centric and Asia-oriented, and one being US-centric and Western-oriented. And I think since a dynamic force, a driving force, an imperative of developing supply chains is efficiency, not just price efficiency, but price efficiency among them, by very definition, having two sort of bipolar supply chains or economic systems be less efficient than a globalized system today. So that's a little bit of a concern. I do think that we are recognizing, this is the reason I think for a little bit of optimism. I think regionalization that you described is real and is happening. ISM has some new research that indicates that for firms with a major supply chain presence in China, which is most global, 30% of them right now have already begun to move some of their supply chain presence outside of mainland China or plan to do so. So that's the first concrete evidence that ISM has seen of people saying, yeah, the China plus one strategy or China plus two is real, and companies are acting on it. And remember, the tariffs the Trump administration imposed are still in place today. And so those tariffs continue to be a major driver of decisions around where do I source based on the commodities I need and the industry that I'm in. So there's a concern around that. But ultimately, the potential benefit of this resiliency from a more regionalized supply chain structure globally probably is to the benefit of both the national security and economic security of countries and people around the globe. And here's why I say that. We always had that sort of supply chain risk as part of the equation, except that especially in the 90s and early 2000s, the overwhelming advantage of labor cost arbitrage, and the advantage of being a low-cost manufacturing environment like China, so overwhelmed any other cost of in terms of component of your cost of goods sold, that none of the other components matter. Well, the labor arbitrage piece isn't there anymore, and we sort of forgot to price in the risk. And we saw that during the pandemic. 80% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China today. And all the medicines that we depend on, for cancer patients or pandemic patients, or you name it, all of those critical medicines, we depend on China for those active pharmaceutical ingredients. If there was a reason for China to turn off that spigot, it would cause major chaos in the world economy. So finding other places to source from and acknowledging that we may have to pay a little higher price for the trade-off of having more resiliency and the opportunity to shift production to a second supplier in case of need, I think that's probably a healthy benefit. I think purists would say, supply chains are going to return to that, that the supply chain cost, like water, always seeks its lowest level, and we're going to get there over time. But I know pharmaceutical companies who are actively pursuing dual sourcing strategies today. So I think the environment has changed. And I think CEOs and boards recognize the risk now, recognize the risk of permanent loss of market share, of foregone sales because you're experiencing stockouts and your competitor isn't, of the sort of fragility of sole source and single source supply-based systems we have commonly around the globe today. So I do believe that we're moving to a different environment slowly over time. And I do believe that will include some nearshoring, but I don't believe it will include reshoring to the United States. I think the United States is still a high-cost country to do business in. Tariffs and taxes make it a high-cost country to do business. And I think, for instance, with the United States, both Mexico and Canada, but particularly northern Mexico, makes more sense as a nearshoring destination for companies that were sourcing from China. And I actually know of many examples of companies that are in Mexico today and have left China.
Yeah, this is so interesting. It's such a rich content. I have so many follow-up questions and thoughts to share.